The snow fell like judgment upon the two Apache sisters standing at Charles Miller's door. Nijoni's proud shoulders trembled not from cold, but from the weight of words she'd never imagined speaking. "We will work, we will cook, we will serve. Let us in." Behind her, 18-year-old Takoda clutched a bundle of their remaining possessions, her dark eyes reflecting the dying light of a world that had cast them out. The ex-soldier's weathered hand hesitated on the door handle, his own ghosts whispering warnings about trust and survival. In that frozen moment, three broken souls stood at the threshold of either salvation or destruction. The mountains held their breath, waiting to witness whether humanity could bloom in the wasteland of hatred. Subscribe to discover if mercy can survive where hope has died. The wind carved through the Rocky Mountain peaks like a blade seeking bone, carrying with it the scent of snow and the bitter taste of endings. Nijoni pressed her cracked lips together, feeling the weight of her sister's trust heavy as stone against her back. 21 winters had taught her that survival often demanded the sacrifice of pride. But standing before this stranger's door, she felt something inside her break like ice under pressure. The wooden planks beneath her feet groaned with the cold, each sound echoing the hollow ache in her chest where certainty used to live. Her fingers, stiff with cold and desperation, traced the rough grain of the door that separated them from warmth, from possibility, from the chance to see another sunrise. Behind her, Takoda's breathing came in small, visible puffs, each exhale a prayer whispered to ancestors who seemed to have turned their faces away. The silence stretched between them and the unknown man beyond the door, thick as the snow clouds gathering overhead. Charles Miller's shadow moved behind the frosted window, a dark shape wrestling with decisions that could damn or deliver them all. Nijoni had seen that hesitation before, in the eyes of soldiers, in the faces of townspeople, in the mirror-still surface of streams that reflected back a world that no longer wanted them. Her hand rose to knock again, but froze mid-air as she caught sight of her own reflection in the glass. Hollow cheeks, eyes that had seen too much, skin weathered by wind and sorrow. This was what desperation looked like, she realized. Not the wild fury of a cornered animal, but the quiet dignity of someone who had already lost everything and was now offering the last thing they possessed, their willingness to serve. The mountains around them stood like silent witnesses, their peaks sharp against the darkening sky, indifferent to the small human drama unfolding at their feet. She could feel Takoda's faith pressing against her spine, warm and fragile as a bird's heartbeat, and knew that whatever happened next would either save them both or destroy the last thread connecting them to hope. The door remained closed, but she could sense movement within, the careful footsteps of a man who had learned to measure trust in careful doses. Through the thin walls, she caught fragments of sound, the scrape of a chair, the whisper of fabric against wood, the soft clink of metal that might have been a gun being set aside or picked up. Her own breathing slowed, matching the rhythm of her sisters, as if they were becoming one creature in their shared vulnerability. The cold bit through their worn clothing, but neither moved to seek shelter elsewhere. There was nowhere else to go, no other door to knock upon, no other chance to speak the words that tasted like ash in her mouth. 21 years of Apache pride warred with the simple animal need to survive, and survival was winning with each passing moment. The wind picked up again, sending snow spiraling around their feet like the ghosts of all the homes they'd lost. All the fires that had been extinguished, all the dreams that had frozen in the high country air. When the door finally opened, it did so with the slow deliberation of a man who had learned that quick movements could mean death. Charles Miller stood framed in the golden light spilling from within, his face a map of old battles and older sorrows, his eyes the color of winter sky just before a storm. He was taller than she had expected, broader through the shoulders, but there was something broken in the way he held himself. A careful stillness that spoke of wounds that had never properly healed. His gaze moved from Nijoni to Takoda and back again, taking in their threadbare clothing, their empty hands, the desperate set of their shoulders. For a moment that stretched like eternity, no one spoke, and the only sound was the wind singing its lonely song through the pines. She could see him weighing their worth against his fear, measuring their need against his own scarred history with people who looked like them. The warmth from inside his cabin touched her face like a promise, carrying with it the sense of coffee and wood smoke and something that might have been hope. "We will work," she heard herself say, the words falling from her lips like stones into still water. "We will cook, we will serve, let us in." Let. The phrase hung in the air between them, heavy with all the things she couldn't say, that they had walked for days through snow that cut like glass, that Takoda's cough had grown worse with each mile, that the last of their food had been shared with a starving dog 2 days ago. She watched his face for signs of the hatred she had grown accustomed to seeing, the quick calculation that reduced them to threats to be eliminated or problems to be ignored. But instead, she saw something unexpected, a flicker of recognition, as if he were seeing not 2 Apache women begging for shelter, but 2 fellow survivors of a world that had tried to break them all. His hand tightened on the doorframe, knuckles white with the effort of holding something back, and she realized that he was fighting his own battle between fear and compassion. The moment stretched between them like a bridge made of spider silk, fragile enough to break with a single wrong word, strong enough to bear the weight of 3 damaged souls if they were careful enough to cross it together. Behind her, Takoda shifted slightly, and Nijoni felt the movement like an echo of her own heartbeat. This was the moment that would define them all, the instant when Charles Miller would either step aside and let them into the warmth, or close the door and leave them to face the mountain winter with nothing but each other and the clothes on their backs. She could see the war playing out behind his eyes, could almost hear the voices of his past arguing with the evidence of his present. 2 young women who posed no threat beyond the challenge they represented to his carefully constructed solitude. The wind gusted again, sending snow swirling around them like a living thing, and she felt Takoda's hand slip into hers, cold fingers seeking warmth, seeking courage, seeking the strength to face whatever came next. In that frozen moment, with the mountains watching and the snow falling like tears from a grieving sky, 3 broken souls stood at the threshold of either salvation or destruction. The hinges sang a rusty song as Charles Miller stepped back, his movement slow and deliberate as a man walking through deep water. The warmth that spilled from the cabin's interior hit Nijoni's face like a physical thing, carrying with it the scents of pine sap and coffee grounds, and something indefinably human that spoke of a life lived in careful solitude. She felt Takoda's grip tighten on her hand, felt the tremor that ran through her sister's small frame, not from cold now, but from the overwhelming relief of a door opening instead of slamming shut. The threshold beneath their feet seemed to stretch like a chasm, that small space between the hostile world and the possibility of sanctuary, between the people they had been forced to become and the people they might yet be allowed to remain. Charles's eyes never left their faces as they crossed into his domain, and she could see him cataloguing every detail. The way Takoda favored her left foot, the careful way Nijoni held her shoulders to hide the exhaustion that threatened to buckle her knees, the desperate dignity that clung to them both like armor made of spider silk. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like the end of one story and the beginning of another. The cabin's interior revealed itself in the golden glow of oil lamps and firelight, a space that spoke of masculine practicality softened by years of solitary living. Rough-hewn furniture bore the marks of careful craftsmanship, each piece built to last through mountain winters and the weight of accumulated loneliness. Nijoni's eyes moved over the details that would define their new world, the stone fireplace that dominated one wall, its hearth blackened by countless fires, the simple wooden table scarred by years of use, The shelves lined with books whose spines spoke of a man who sought escape in other people's words. The air itself seemed thick with unspoken stories, with the accumulated silence of a man who had grown accustomed to hearing only his own footsteps, his own breathing, his own thoughts echoing in the mountain stillness. She could feel Takoda drinking in the warmth, could see her sister's shoulders beginning to relax for the first time in weeks, and felt something tight in her own chest begin to loosen like a fist slowly opening. This was what safety looked like, she realized, not the absence of danger, but the presence of walls that would hold against the wind, of fire that would burn through the night, of a man who had chosen mercy over fear. Charles moved through his space with the careful economy of someone who had learned to live alone, each gesture precise and purposeful as he cleared space for his unexpected guests. His hands, she noticed, bore the calluses of hard work and the thin white scars that spoke of old violence, but they moved with surprising gentleness as he pulled chairs closer to the fire, as he lifted a kettle from its hook above the flames. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who understood that words could be dangerous things, that trust was built in small increments like stones carefully placed to build a wall. She watched him measure coffee into a battered pot, watched the way his shoulders held tension like a man perpetually ready for attack, and recognized in him something of her own wariness, her own careful distance from a world that had proven itself capable of infinite cruelty. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with disuse, the words emerging like smoke from a fire that had been banked but not extinguished. "There's a room in the back," he said, not looking at them directly. "Small, but it's warm. You can stay there." The offer hung in the air between them, simple and profound as the difference between life and death. Takoda's breath caught audibly, a small sound that might have been a sob or a prayer, or simply the release of tension that had been building for so long it had become part of her bones. Nijoni felt her own throat tighten with emotions she couldn't afford to name. Gratitude and relief, and something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to hope. She had expected to have to prove their worth immediately, to begin the work that would justify their presence, but Charles seemed content to let them simply exist in his space, to warm themselves by his fire and drink his coffee and remember what it felt like to be safe. The flames danced in the fireplace, casting shifting shadows on the walls that seemed to move with their own life, and she found herself mesmerized by the simple beauty of light and warmth and the sound of wind held at bay by solid walls. This was what they had been walking toward through all those cold miles, she realized, not just shelter, but the possibility of belonging somewhere again, of being seen as something other than a problem to be solved, or a threat to be eliminated. The coffee, when Charles handed it to her, was bitter and strong, and tasted like the first good thing that had happened to them in longer than she could remember. The room he showed them was indeed small, barely large enough for the narrow bed and simple washstand it contained, but it felt like a palace after weeks of sleeping on frozen ground with only each other's warmth for comfort. The walls were solid logs, chinked with mud and moss, and the single window looked out onto a vista of snow-covered pines that stretched to the horizon like a promise of endless possibility. Takoda sank onto the bed with a sigh that seemed to come from her very soul, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears as she looked around their new sanctuary. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and Nijoni knew she wasn't talking about the room itself, but about what it represented. The first step back from the edge of a cliff they had been walking for so long, they had forgotten what solid ground felt like. The blankets on the bed were thick and clean, smelling faintly of lavender and sunshine, and when Nijoni touched them, she felt something inside her chest crack open like ice in spring. They would sleep warm tonight, she realized. They would wake tomorrow in a place where they were wanted, where their presence was not a burden to be endured, but a gift to be carefully tended. The thought was almost too large to hold, too bright to look at directly, like staring into the sun, after months of darkness. As night settled over the mountains like a blanket made of stars and silence, Nijoni stood at the window watching the snow fall in the lamplight that spilled from the main room. Behind her, Takoda had already fallen asleep, her breathing deep and even for the first time in weeks, her face peaceful in the golden glow. From the other room came the soft sounds of Charles moving through his evening routine, the scrape of a chair, the rustle of pages turning, the occasional pop and hiss of the fire settling into its nighttime rhythm. These were the sounds of home, she realized. The small domestic symphonies that spoke of lives lived in safety and routine and the luxury of planning for tomorrow. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, feeling the contrast between the warmth at her back and the winter beyond the walls, and marveled at how quickly the world could change, how a single door opening could transform two desperate refugees into something that felt almost like family. The mountains stood silent and eternal around them, their peaks lost in clouds that promised more snow. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, the cold felt like something that existed outside, rather than something that lived in her bones. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own careful negotiations between three damaged souls learning to share the same small space. But tonight there was warmth and safety, and the sound of her sister breathing easily in sleep. Escrivos Capítulos 3-5. Chapter 3. The Weight of Unspoken Truths. The morning arrived with the kind of silence that settles deep into a person's chest, heavy and expectant. Nijoni woke before dawn, as she always did, her body trained by years of vigilance to never fully surrender to sleep. The cabin held the lingering warmth of the previous night's fire, but beneath it lay something else, the careful tension of three strangers learning to breathe the same air. She could hear Charles moving quietly in the kitchen, the soft scrape of a coffee pot against the stove, and knew that he too had risen early, perhaps unable to sleep with the weight of his decisions settling around him like snow. Takoda still slept, her face peaceful in the grey light filtering through the small window, and Nijoni felt the familiar ache of protection rise in her throat. Her sister had always been the dreamer, the one who saw possibility where others saw only hardship. And watching her now, Nijoni wondered if she had made the right choice in bringing them here. The white man's kindness felt fragile, temporary, like ice that might crack under the weight of too much hope. She had learned not to trust easily, had seen too many promises broken by men who spoke with gentle voices and carried violence in their hearts. The smell of coffee drew her from the small room they had been given, and she found Charles standing at the window, his shoulders rigid with some internal struggle. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and she saw in his eyes the same wariness she carried, the same careful distance that came from being hurt too many times. "Coffee's ready," he said simply, his voice rough with mourning and unspoken thoughts. She nodded, accepting the cup he offered, and they stood in silence, two people who understood that words could be weapons as easily as comfort. "Your sister," he said finally, his gaze drifting toward the closed door where Takoda slept. "She reminds me of someone I used to know." There was pain in his voice, old and deep, and Nijoni recognized the particular ache of loss that never quite healed. She waited, knowing that some stories could only be told in their own time, that pushing would only drive him back into the silence that seemed to be his natural state. The coffee was strong and bitter, warming her hands through the chipped ceramic cup, and she found herself grateful for this small kindness, this moment of shared quiet before the day demanded its due. When Takoda finally emerged, her hair still tangled with sleep, and her eyes bright with the kind of optimism that made Nijoni's heart clench with protective fear, the careful balance of the morning shifted. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying the musical quality that had always made people stop and listen. And Charles's expression softened in a way that made Nijoni both hopeful and afraid. Her sister had always had this effect on people, this ability to make them believe in better things, but Nizhoni had learned that hope could be the most dangerous emotion of all. The day stretched ahead of them, full of unspoken negotiations and careful boundaries, and as Nizhoni watched Charles hand Takoda a cup of coffee with the same gentle care he might show a wounded bird, she felt the first stirring of something she had thought lost forever, the possibility that they might actually belong somewhere again. But belonging, she knew, always came with a price, and she could only hope that when the time came to pay it, they would all survive the cost. Chapter 4. The Language of Shared Labor. The work began without ceremony, as most necessary things do, with Takoda rolling up her sleeves and asking where she might find the flour. Charles had guests arriving by week's end, a family traveling west who had sent word ahead, and the cabin needed the kind of deep cleaning that spoke of care rather than mere survival. Nizhoni watched her sister move through the small kitchen with the confidence of someone who had learned to make a home wherever she found herself, and felt the familiar mixture of pride and worry that came with loving someone so trusting. Charles worked alongside them with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to solitude, but Nizhoni noticed the way his movements had changed since yesterday, less guarded, more open to the rhythm they were creating together. When Takoda hummed softly while kneading bread, he paused in his sweeping to listen, and something in his face relaxed in a way that made him look younger, less burdened by whatever ghosts he carried. The sound filled the cabin like sunlight, warm and golden, and Nizhoni found herself remembering their grandmother's kitchen, the way music had always been part of the work. The afternoon brought its own challenges as they tackled the guest rooms, stripping beds and washing windows with the methodical care that transformed a space from merely functional to welcoming. Nizhoni worked with the focused intensity she brought to everything, but she was aware of the conversations happening around her. Takoda's gentle questions about the land, Charles's careful answers that revealed more than he perhaps intended. He spoke of the mountains with the reverence of someone who had found peace in their silence, and she began to understand that this place was his refuge as much as it might become theirs. When the bread emerged from the oven, golden and fragrant, filling the cabin with the smell of home, Charles stood in the doorway watching Takoda slice it with the same wonder she had seen on children's faces during feast days. "I haven't had fresh bread in," he began, then stopped as if the admission revealed too much. But Takoda simply smiled and handed him a thick slice, still warm, and said, "Then it's time you did." The simple exchange carried weight beyond its words, a recognition of hunger that went deeper than food. As evening approached, and they sat around the small table sharing the meal they had prepared together, Nizhoni felt something shift in the careful distance they had all maintained. The bread was good, the stew rich with vegetables from Charles's small garden, and the conversation flowed with the easy rhythm of people who had worked side by side. Takoda told stories of their childhood, carefully edited versions that spoke of joy without revealing too much pain, and Charles listened with the attention of someone starved for human connection. When Takoda asked about the scar that ran along Charles's left hand, visible when he reached for the salt, Nizhoni tensed, ready to deflect the question that might shatter this fragile peace. But Charles looked at his hand as if seeing it for the first time, then said quietly, "Shrapnel." From a war that should have ended long before it did. The honesty in his voice was raw, unguarded, and Nizhoni realized that they were all carrying wounds that might never fully heal, but perhaps could be tended in the company of others who understood. The night settled around them like a blanket, soft and forgiving, and for the first time in months, Nizhoni allowed herself to imagine a future that stretched beyond mere survival. Chapter 5. The Price of Acceptance. The riders appeared on the third morning like a dark stain against the snow, their horses breathing steam in the cold air as they approached the cabin with the deliberate slowness of men who carried authority and knew how to use it. Najoni saw them first from the kitchen window where she stood, washing dishes, and the sight sent ice through her veins. 3 men in heavy coats, their faces hard with the kind of certainty that had driven her people from their lands. She called softly to Dakota, who was sweeping the front room, and saw her sister's face pale as she understood the danger approaching their fragile sanctuary. Charles emerged from the barn, where he had been tending to his horses, and Najoni watched through the window as the lead rider dismounted and approached him with the swagger of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She could not hear their words, but she could read the tension in Charles's shoulders, the way he positioned himself between the men and the cabin, and knew that their brief peace was about to be tested. The conversation grew heated, voices rising in the thin mountain air, and she saw Charles's hand move instinctively toward his hip, where a gun might once have rested. "We should go," Dakota whispered, her voice tight with the fear they had both learned to carry like a second skin. "We should take what we can and leave before—" But Najoni shook her head, something fierce and protective rising in her chest. They had run too many times, had accepted too many defeats, and watching Charles stand alone against 3 men who clearly meant them harm, she felt a loyalty she had not expected bloom like fire in her bones. This man had given them shelter when the world had turned its back, had shared his bread and his silence, and she would not abandon him to face the consequences alone. The confrontation lasted nearly an hour, voices carrying on the wind in fragments that spoke of law and order, of proper places and unwelcome guests. Najoni saw money change hands, saw Charles's shoulders sag with what might have been defeat or relief. And when the riders finally mounted and rode away, she felt as if she had been holding her breath for a lifetime. Charles stood in the yard long after they disappeared, his head bowed, and when he finally turned toward the cabin, his face carried the weight of decisions that would change everything. "They'll be back," he said when he entered, his voice flat with exhaustion. "In a week, maybe 2. They want you gone, and they're not the type to forget or forgive." Dakota made a small sound of distress, but Najoni felt only the familiar resignation that came with being unwanted wherever they went. She had expected this, had known that their sanctuary was temporary, but the pain of it still cut deep. Charles looked at them both, his eyes holding something that might have been regret or determination, and said quietly, "Unless you're willing to stay and fight for what we've built here." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge that might bear their weight or collapse beneath them, and Najoni felt the moment stretch taut with possibility and danger. To stay meant risking everything, their safety, their lives, the fragile trust they had built with this damaged man who had shown them kindness when the world offered only cruelty. But to leave meant returning to the endless wandering, the constant fear, the slow erosion of hope that came with having no place to call home. She looked at her sister's face, saw the same desperate longing she felt in her own heart, and knew that some fights were worth the risk of losing everything.